Welcome to One Police Plaza. And thank you for being here today to listen to this very important law enforcement message. I am Deputy Chief Emmanuel Katronakis, Commanding Officer of the NYPD's Forensic Investigations Division. And with me today, to my right, Special Narcotics Prosecutor Bridget Brennan. Also, to my left is the Assistant Special Agent in charge, Eric Triana, from the Drug Enforcement Administration. To my far right is Nigel Farina, who is a co-chief of the Narcotics Gang Unit. Also, to my left, Susan Lanzatella, another co-chief with the Special Narcotics Prosecutors Gang Unit. And finally, Assistant District Attorney Callie Lloyd with the Special Narcotics Prosecutor. So now I'm going to ask the Special Narcotics Prosecutor to present this very important law enforcement message to you.
Well, whoa. Hope she doesn't fall down first. I'm a little taller than I thought I was. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for coming to hear about this important issue. And thank you to the New York City Police Department for hosting us on this. First and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge the hard work, dedication, professionalism exemplified by everyone who worked on that report. We have here with us today Assistant District Attorneys and Co-Chiefs of our Narcotics Unit, Susan Lanzatella and Nigel Farina, who guided it, and Callie Lloyd, who worked so hard on it. But they, of course, weren't alone. The NYPD lab did excellent work, as did the city's Office of the Chief Medical Examiner. The investigative work on this case involved several units, including the DEA, which has always been one of our critical partners. Brooklyn South Gang Unit worked on this, Brooklyn South Narcotics. Both NYPD units worked on this. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the grand jury, who devoted so many hours to poring over the evidence in this case. They sat for 5 months, heard from 72 witnesses, reviewed 250 exhibits, and Manhattan Supreme Court Justice Abraham Klott reviewed this grand jury report and did certify that the evidence supported the recommendations. This grand jury report is the first ever issued by the Office of the Special Narcotics Prosecutor in its 50-year history. The report is authorized by state law and allows a grand jury to propose recommendations for legislative, executive, or administrative actions based on their finding. The examination of the deadly impact of fentanyl analogs, the current laws regulating them, and the tools for detecting them was thorough. The recommendations for change are very simple and straightforward. First, New York State needs more comprehensive laws to regulate all fentanyl analogs that exhibit lethal potential. Secondly, our police lab technicians, our medical examiners need better tools to detect these analogs, which are so potent that they're found in very, very low concentrations and require ever more sensitive equipment. This grand jury report recognizes both the profound shortcomings of our current state law, regulating some of the most deadly drugs we have ever seen, and recognizes that the experts we rely on to identify and track these drugs, which are responsible for so many deaths, have insufficient resources at this time. Fentanyl analogs have been linked to roughly 900 overdose deaths in New York City since 2017. Now, when we look at overdose deaths, we often see a combination of deadly drugs used. And fentanyl analogs have showed up more and more frequently in our overdose deaths. There have been more fentanyl-involved fatalities than homicides in this time frame. Fentanyl analogs have no legitimate medical use. They are primarily produced in China and shipped to New York through U.S. mails or package delivery services, sometimes from a transshipment center located outside of China and available for sale over the dark web. We have occasionally detected them in bulk drug transfers, seizures that have crossed the southwest border originating in Mexico, but that is not the usual source that we see. Fentanyl is up to 50 times more potent than heroin. An analog is simply a variation on fentanyl. It has the same effect, but it has a little bit of a different molecular composition. And our state law has regulated the prohibited substances based on their molecular compositions. And so when a little tweak of fentanyl appears, it may no longer be regulated. And that's what we've seen happening in increasing circumstances. A handful of analogs have specifically been added to the list of controlled substances. But this is not the most effective or efficient means of regulation. The federal law has a temporary prohibition on fentanyl analogs which have the same effect as fentanyl. Now, what we think would be best would be if state law would mimic federal law. There's no reason why something should be prohibited federally and not by New York State, because you should understand what that means to us as investigators. Our goal now, and the strategy that we employ in most narcotics cases, is to identify the deadly sources of drugs. And with fentanyl analogs, if a substance is identified as purely an analog, which isn't on the list of prohibited substances, we cannot use our ordinarily law enforcement tools to find the source of that drugs. What does that mean? Well, certainly it means we can't make arrests, but it also means that we can't obtain search warrants. We can't use wiretaps. We can't use all those means that we use to find the top of the supply chain. And because these analogs are coming in this way, we have seen deaths associated with a particular analog in particular geographic areas. And it's very concentrated. Then again, we need the help of the lab to identify what that analog is. And we try to use our ordinary tools to track it back, because what we're looking to do is to prevent these deaths. But without the aid of everything that we typically use in dealing with lethal drugs, we are sorely handicapped in our efforts to control this deadly substance. New variations of this drug appear frequently, and the potency of them, of the analogs, may actually be higher than fentanyl. In general, the fentanyl analogs have the same effect on the body as fentanyl. They suppress respiration. They are absorbed by the body very, very quickly. And they are often mixed in with heroin, with fentanyl, with other supplies of drugs. Our report concludes that fentanyl analogs are packaged and sold just like heroin or fentanyl. They cost less to acquire, leading to higher profits for dealers. And often the packages that come from foreign sources in the mails or in package deliveries are much, much more concentrated than the fentanyl we seize in bulk shipments from Mexico. They are largely unregulated in New York State, and the failure to regulate prevents law enforcement from acting quickly to protect the public by dismantling organizations whose activities result in overdose deaths. I think sometimes it's easier if you can see visually a depiction of the statistical information on this. So we've prepared some slides, and we've done it with the assistance of our analyst unit, many of whom who worked on this are sitting over there, and they worked very hard on this grand jury, with this grand jury, providing the grand jury with the information that they needed. All right. This slide represents analog overdose deaths in New York City by months. And these are deaths where some analog was detected. And we saw analogs starting to be a real presence in 2016 and then increasingly through the years. These are a variety of different analogs, but this is a compilation of overdose deaths resulting from fentanyl analogs. This is a list of 14 different analogs, all of which have been present in New York City overdose deaths since 2017, Susan? Since 2017. And only the two asterisk one, acetylfentanyl and carfentanil, are on the New York State list of controlled substances. Now, this is kind of a heat map. The darker the brown, the higher the concentration of deaths linked to analogs. And as you can see, it's a compilation from 2017 to the present, and it does follow some of the trajectory of the highest rates of overdose deaths in the city, with Staten Island representing a significant density in overdose deaths, the Bronx, the South Bronx, South and Central Bronx, Upper Manhattan, and pocket in Brooklyn and South Brooklyn. What this slide shows you is the increasing presence of analogs associated with deaths. The heat map on the left reflects overdoses by precincts in 2017, and 2018 is on the right, or excuse me, on, trying to figure out which side it is, on the other side. And as you can see, the purple is becoming deeper and deeper and is highly correlated with those areas where we see significant overdose deaths. Right now in the city, the county with the highest rate of overdose death is the Bronx. Now, we pulled these just to show you how random the presence of these analogs can be. Acetylfentanyl is the analog which shows up in more overdose deaths than any others. And you can see it has a higher presence and a lower presence. It goes up and down. Fentanyl, one of those which is unregulated, had a very high presence for a while, then it faded out. We see these other two analogs, I'm not even going to try to pronounce the names, but we see them having, in a sense, in and out. And what you can see from that, and what that demonstrates, is just the randomness of it. So that if you attempted to legislate by molecular composition, you're going to be way, way behind the trend, and you're really going to inhibit our ability to remove those drugs which are causing a significant number of deaths. And just to show you the problems that we're facing now, fentanyl and fentanyl analogs, the reason I believe they have become so present on our black market is because they are so much more potent and so much cheaper than heroin. They're both all synthetic products. And the precursor chemicals for fentanyl probably come from China, but most of the fentanyl that we're seizing in bulk is coming from Mexico. And as you see, the proportion of our large seizures that involve fentanyl has increased, as has the portion of fentanyl analog seizures. And that's the challenge that we're facing at this time. Oops. So finally, I'd like to conclude by reading to you the grand jury's recommendations. After they really took a lot of time to examine this information, they issued two recommendations. One, the New York State Legislature should pass legislation that prohibits both the sale and possession of any fentanyl analog. Obviously, the actual legal language of that would have to be worked out. But given the rapid fluctuation in types of fentanyl analog, the increasing number of fentanyl analogs being seized in connection with overdose deaths, the legislature should take notice of the ease with the chemical composition of fentanyl can be tweaked, and the ease with which lower-level criminal organizations are getting their hands on this deadly substance. And accordingly, it is inadequate for our laws to merely prescribe the handful of fentanyl analogs currently prohibited in New York State. If law enforcement can't disrupt the distribution of fentanyl analogs, more will make their way into our communities and more overdoses will occur. In addition, the grand jury recommends that the legislature should allocate additional funding for laboratories conducting controlled substance analysis for law enforcement, including the New York City Police Lab and the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, which does the mortality investigations and the toxicology reports, as well as labs doing similar analysis throughout the state. The grand jury heard about the challenges posed by the testing of fentanyl analogs and the importance of laboratories being able to positively identify these dangerous substances. Finally, additional funding should be directed toward increasing community awareness about the dangers of fentanyl analogs and the high risk of overdose. While communities across the state continue to battle this opioid epidemic, it's crucial that individuals, particularly those in communities hardest hit by the proliferation of these analogs, receive up-to-date information about the volatility of the drug mixtures, the unpredictability of an unknown mixture's effect, as well as information about treatment options available for those battling substance use. As head of this agency for the past 20 years, I've seen the tragedy of the opioid epidemic unfold. First with prescription drugs, then heroin and fentanyl, and I view this as the fourth wave. And we can't be caught flat-footed again. So I will work to urge the legislature to pass the appropriate bills, the appropriate legislation, which would allow us to use the most effective tools we have at our disposal to cut off the supply of these deadly drugs. And now I would like to introduce Associate Special Agent in Charge in the New York Field Office, Eric Triana.
Good afternoon. The most lethal drug threat that we face stems from the introduction of fentanyl to drug traffickers. Synthetic fentanyl and its analogs are man-made, they're cheap to make and buy, very profitable, and potent in small doses. Fentanyl, by far, is the deadliest drug. It's mixed with drugs such as heroin, cocaine, and it has even been found in marijuana in upstate New York. 45% of drug overdose deaths that occurred between 2016 and 2017 in the U.S. was the result of synthetic opioids other than methadone. Every year, we're losing the equivalent of a stadium full of people due to drug overdoses. Fentanyl and its analogs fuel foreign drug trafficking organizations, and there are two main source countries. DEA investigations have uncovered rogue drug laboratories in China and Mexico that supply to U.S. distribution networks. Traditional Mexico-based drug trafficking networks, such as the Sinaloa cartel, with established infrastructure and smuggling routes, supply the U.S. with heroin and fentanyl and its analogs. Mexican cartels purchase precursor chemicals and have even been found to now attempting to produce their own precursor chemicals. They purchase them from Chinese traffickers, and they produce the fentanyl in laboratories and then send the fentanyl across our borders to distribute them nationwide. DEA recently seized and destroyed, with our Mexican counterparts, 10 full production laboratories in Mexico producing fentanyl. It's proof that unfortunately fentanyl isn't a trend, it's here to stay, and it's the new mainframe for trafficking organizations. The second method of fentanyl and its analogs are based on U.S. traffickers. Domestic trafficking organizations are ordering fentanyl on the dark web, mainly supplied by China, and mixing it with traditional drugs for sales on the streets. Fentanyl is not only found in powder form, but it's in pill form, including pills to mimic pharmaceuticals, and are counterfeit. As more and more fentanyl analogs are smuggled into the United States in bulk, American lives are at risk because, whether knowingly or unknowingly, are exposed to the most dangerous drug ever to hit the U.S. streets. In February 2018, DEA emergency temporarily scheduled all illicit fentanyl analogs that were not scheduled in an effort to reduce these overdose deaths. This makes it easy for federal prosecutors, along with agents, to prosecute trafficking organizations. This scheduling action was critical because our investigations have revealed efforts by clandestine chemists working for drug trafficking organizations to evade prosecution by changing the molecular structure, thus creating fentanyl analogs. Since the temporary emergency scheduling of fentanyl analogs expires in February 2020, DEA supports fully the permanent scheduling of all illicit fentanyl analogs in the future to save lives. We commend the New York City Office of Special Narcotics Prosecutor on their persistent efforts in drug enforcement, prevention, and education. The DEA has partnered with this office and are consistently working on informing the public on drug-related threats and emerging trends to safeguard the public. It is no surprise they are on the forefront of efforts to schedule fentanyl analogs in New York, and we commend them for their tenacious pursuit to keep the city safe from drug use, abuse, and overdoses. Thank you.
Okay, so at this time, we're going to take some on-topic questions. You guys want to just join me? Sure.
Do you have any hard numbers for the number of deaths caused by these analogs, like say for 2017 versus 2018, that you can share? Or going back further?
Could I get you the specific numbers after the conference?
Sure.
Okay.
Chief, does the New York City Police Department Crime Lab have the capacity now, the limited form or whatever, to do the analysis to pick up the analogs, or are you in need of more funding to get more equipment?
So we need additional funding to support the challenges that we face analyzing and testing these analogs that we're seeing. So without a doubt, the funding is going to be very, very important moving forward. The analogs are, as you see in the grand jury report, unpredictable, where we cannot, in certain instances, determine what we expect to see tomorrow. So in many instances, it requires a great deal of time and labor to determine precisely what it is that we're looking to characterize on a scientific level. So as far as resources, to answer your question, without a doubt, funding is going to be very, very important as we face these challenges moving forward with the ever-expanding analogs that we're seeing in the laboratory. And currently we do have some capability, but there are challenges that we do face every single day, and those resources and the funding is going to be something that's critical moving forward.
Chief Katranakis, can you say, how much you're looking for and what that will go toward? And then a second question is, part of the report seems to emphasize how that people are kind of not being arrested because these compounds are illegal. And I'm wondering, if you have a sense of how many people, how many traffickers that we're talking about are getting to escape free because there's no prohibition on these drugs.
So I'm sorry, can you just repeat the first question again?
The first question is how much money you're seeking, and what that would go towards, specifically the crime lab, hiring panels, samples.
So I don't have details on the funding amounts for you today, but I can tell you without a doubt that funding is going to be critical if we're going to meet the challenges that we face in the future. The second question, I think, is more appropriately answered by the Special Narcotics Prosecutor, perhaps the Drug Enforcement Administration.
I don't have specific numbers on how many people we've had to release. What happens is often the substance, when you arrest someone, there's a presumption because it's sold as heroin or fentanyl that that's what it is. And so they may be arrested and charged, and you don't know until the laboratory comes back that shows no New York State controlled substance is what it typically shows, that we don't have the ability to prosecute that case. So I don't know the total number of cases that have been affected that way, but I can tell you this, that we have been involved in investigations, one investigation in particular that was directly hampered by this, where we were looking at a concentration of deaths in South Brooklyn and overdoses in South Brooklyn, and we believed we had an outline of the supply chain. And we were proceeding with our investigation using our ordinary investigative techniques, whether it be undercover buys, arrests and seizures, et cetera, and we were stymied in our efforts to move forward on that case and did have to release certain defendants in that case. One of them had 800 glass scenes.
And how much weight is that in fentanyl or?
Well, I mean, here's the hard part about it, too. What we have seen with the amount of fentanyl that will, kill an ordinary person is just a tiny amount. It would fit on the tip of your finger. But the fentanyl analogs tend to be even more concentrated. And so with the fentanyl analogs, it's not specific. It doesn't correlate to a weight in quite that same way. But 800 bags, I mean, the typical, I don't know what were those selling for $10 a bag? Yeah, I mean, they're usually dime bags, so it's $8,000 worth of product. 8,000 customers, or depends on how many people were going to buy, or how many bags a person would buy. So the impact can be quite substantial, and that's how we began focusing on this issue, to tell you the truth, because we were so stymied in this investigation. We couldn't proceed on it until they mixed it with heroin. At some point it was heroin they mixed it with, right? And so then we were able to start moving up the ladder at that point. But if you're writing a search warrant, you have to have probable cause to believe a crime is being committed, and if it's not a crime, it's not a crime. Same thing is true of wiretap investigations or any of the tools that you most frequently use in narcotics investigations.
Can you describe the reach and the size of this operation?
That particular operation, it was, how many people did we end up arresting in that organization? Yeah, we took it down in two different segments that were operating in two different areas in Brooklyn, and a total of 14 people were arrested in connection with that. But the source of supply was higher up, feeding to two different organizations that were supplying in two different areas.
When you say higher up, was that in domestically or international?
No, that was domestically. Source of supply, we believe, was coming in package from, China. Originally from China, what? And one of the defendants in that case was charged with major trafficker, as a major trafficker. So one of the elements of that crime is that you have to prove that they're dealing with or profiteering $75,000 over a period of 6 months.
These prosecutions went through, correct?
Yes.
So
Because eventually they mixed it with heroin.
are you encountering analog-only operations?
Well, we can't go very far on an analog-only operation, so, we're not able to stick with it for all that long.
But you encountered that?
Well, this was analog only until they mixed it with heroin. You know what I mean? They could have just not mixed it with heroin at some point. There's again, I hate to reuse this word, but there's a certain randomness on the black market. People can obtain the illicit substances through a number of different sources, and so the user seldom knows what they're getting, really knows what they're getting.
If I could just make
You
one
go right
comment.
ahead.
So just to get to the pointed question, in fact, we have evidence submitted to the NYPD Police Laboratory that is analog only. Many, 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 many cases that are analog only cases where we perform analysis and we see a analog that is not scheduled in the New York State public health law as a controlled substance.
Does that spin off like singular overdose death? Is that what you're talking about? Or you're talking about larger investigations?
So we're talking about the variety. So some of these analog onlys are attributed to overdose investigations. Some of them are attributed in prosecutions. Some of these are attributed in the host of permutations that the laboratory will receive a submission of evidence.
So why aren't dealers just doing analog only to avoid prosecution? Or do they not always know necessarily what they're getting?
So I don't know if you want to
Sure,
maybe...
I'll make a comment. So DA, as over the last 2-3 years, has seized numerous kilogram quantities over dozens and dozens of investigations of fentanyl analog only. And prior to the temporary scheduling, we encountered some of the similar prosecution issues that Bridget has encountered as well. We federally have something called the Analog Act, the Controlled Substance Analog Act, that we can utilize when something's not scheduled by showing different elements to a jury and proving beyond a reasonable doubt that the dealer knew that it was intended for human consumption, molecular structures substantially similar, pharmacological effects substantially similar. Again, these are additional hurdles. So for us, in February of 2018, we were able to solve that by temporary emergency scheduling that. But I can say for sure that not only has kilos been seized in New York over the last few years on numerous investigations, but kilos seized destined to New York with there were fentanyl analogs.
Yes, if someone can answer this. Is the Sinaloa cartel still operating even with the conviction of El Chapo? And you're seeing imports of this substance from them?
Yes, it is still operating. Another cartel, CJNG, has seized on the moment of Sinaloa cartel in the infighting and has been increasingly its numbers, and they're also involved in the fentanyl networks.
And would you describe analog as like a derivative of fentanyl, or is it just molecularly different?
So a fentanyl analog, when we say substantially similar molecular structure, we're really just changing a molecule here and there, these clandestine chemists, and having the same type of effect on a person. So the euphoric effect, the ability, obviously, to overdose, all those effects being substantially similar. That's what we define as an analog.
I know you talked earlier about your about the why you can prosecute and why you cannot prosecute with analog. We had a little audio issue, so if you can just summarize that part of why you cannot prosecute or go forward with these words.
Yes. New York state law specifies the substances which are prohibited substances. They're put on the list of controlled substances. And if an analog, although it may have the very similar molecular structure as fentanyl, may have either the same effect or a more profound effect, if it isn't exactly the same molecular structure, we can't prosecute that case, which means we can't obtain search warrants to find the stashes for it. We can't obtain eavesdropping warrants, wiretaps, to find the source of supply. And really, with regard to a narcotics prosecution, it doesn't matter if those analogs have caused deaths. If we don't have probable cause to believe a crime is being committed, that is the sale of a narcotic drug, we are unable to use the typical law enforcement tools that we use to tackle these problems.
You were saying something earlier about a federal versus state.
Yes, the federal law now has temporary scheduling, emergency scheduling, which prohibits analogs, fentanyl analogs, that have substantially the same effect on the body as fentanyl. New York State does not have any analogous provision.
Tony?
I think you said earlier that, is it the Bronx that has the highest rate of fentanyl analog deaths, or all over?
It has overall the highest rate of overdose deaths in the city now.
Okay, and so just to follow up, obviously you're aware of the issues. You have the grand jury report, and you've been investigating and coming across this. Is this really the fentanyl analog problem? Is this really a problem that's really caught the public unaware?
I think so. My cocktail party conversation about analogs, people generally don't know what I'm talking about. And when you talk about fentanyl, for that matter, I would say the general population is not well aware of the profound effects of fentanyl. When you say fentanyl, I mean, most ordinary people just think of the anesthesia that they receive before a minor surgery. They are not thinking of the illicit synthetic product that's killing so many people.
What's the purpose of going to a grand jury? What legal proof does it give you? And then second question, maybe for the DEA, could the federal law be extended?
A grand jury report requires that we present evidence to a grand jury on an issue of public importance and public interest, and then they vote recommendations. It has to be reviewed by a judge. So to the extent that there might be concern that it's not an objective presentation or an objective recommendation that's actually in the public interest, you do have the validification of a grand jury vote on the report and on the recommendations.
And just the second part of the question, is it possible that the federal schedule could be extended?
So yes, so it's we. When I say we, with other agencies, can make a permanent ban prior to expiration in February 2020. DEA, along with Health and Human Services and congressional approval, can make that permanent ban. It's an 8-factor analysis, and that analysis involves scientific and medical testing and evaluation. So right now, that's what DEA is pursuing.
What could theoretically be the obstacles to that, just based on your experience?
The obstacles could be sometimes, while we fully support all applications for research from the scientific community, once it does become a Schedule I, the application process sometimes for the scientific medical community can be a little more burdensome. So these are some of the issues that they have.
So, on that question, part of the concern about scheduling fentanyl is that people's addictions might be criminalized. I'm wondering if the grand jury made any kind of considered that in their recommendation, and if you have any thoughts about that.
Fentanyl is on the schedule. Fentanyl itself is on the schedule of controlled substances. It's used for fentanyl for medicinal purposes, but the fact that you have more potent and lethal substances in the mixture of drugs on the black market may not affect addiction as much as it affects overdose deaths. They're just more potent. But the grand jury did make a recommendation for enhanced education and enhanced prevention measures. That was something that we're all very concerned about as well.
I was intrigued when you mentioned this is kind of the fourth wave of this crisis. If you could kind of compare timelines in those different waves, where are we in this one compared to where we were in heroin or with prescription drugs? Is this growing worse, and what's ahead if you look at those?
Well, we started to see fentanyl analogs. I think they first appeared 2016, and had a more profound appearance in 2017 and have been growing. And so I think my fear is that we haven't peaked out yet. What I see from my perspective with regard to the waves we've gone through, I mean, the only kind of homegrown wave was the prescription pill epidemic. And that got off to a slow start. And when I say we don't want to be flat-footed again, that's what I'm thinking of the prescription pill epidemic, where there were all kinds of warning signs that we didn't respond to. Here in New York City, it didn't impact us as early as it impacted other places. The first time I would say that my office saw it was probably in 2010, when we started to seize stashes of prescription pills alongside heroin and cocaine, and knew that there was a heavy black market in it, and then went back to identify what the source of the drugs was, and realized that it wasn't just a pallet of drugs that had been stolen, that they were being prescribed. Ultimately, it was called injudicious prescriptions in New York City. So that began in 2010. Around the same time, we started to see heroin come in bulk and purity that we hadn't previously seen. But I think we're always one step behind. So I think the prescription pill crisis had escalated and the heroin just followed along. And the heroin deaths escalated, but not nearly, overdose deaths didn't nearly escalate to the point they did when fentanyl was introduced. And we saw the big spike up in deaths 2016 over 2015. And just to give you a sense of it, our fentanyl seizures in 2016 were about, 30 pounds or something? And by 2017, we had seized 500 pounds of fentanyl. The deaths occurred, the big spike up in deaths, I think they increased by about 51% in New York City. That was in 2016 over 15. So we're always one step behind. We're always responding to yesterday's crisis. Not that it's not important, because that crisis continues to trend. But this one is really difficult because the way a lot of the analogs are coming in is so diffuse. It's coming into that big international mail reception center in JFK. And since it's so pure and such a minute amount can be effective, it can come in a greeting card or a lingerie package or, anything. And so it's much more diffuse and harder to turn off the source of supply at the highest possible point.
And given one of the recommendations here from a lawmaking point of view, given that you can kind of tweak this and make it seems like almost an infinite amount of varieties of this, is there a way for lawmakers to kind of catch all of this under one umbrella, catch all the future varieties under one umbrella?
Well, I think the model would be the federal analog, the temporary federal analog statute. I think that's the best model out there, and I know that there are ongoing federal efforts to address it in the source countries through our relationships with China and Mexico to try to, again, the wisest course of action is to cut off supply at the source. So that's what we're always trying to do.
One or two more? I could just enhance. Just one point to answer your question, too. Is there a specific model that we can look to or legislators can look to emulate? And the answer is looking at cocaine. So when you look at cocaine specifically in the law, it's the isomers, which are both positional, geometrical, or optical isomers, or any analogs. So there are stereoisomers, there are analogs of cocaine, but you haven't heard about them, we haven't discussed them, and it's never been an obstacle or a challenge on the criminal justice side of the house because the law basically coalesced with the public interest as far as the dangers of cocaine. So that's just something to kind of add on what the Special Narcotics prosecutor said.
I would ask, where's the city on this? It's interesting that this report is coming from S&P and DEA and NYPD and not the health department. And Ms. Brennan, you mentioned in your city council testimony that the city just kind of had no kind of prevention plan a few months ago, it was a while ago, that the city had no prevention plan to prevent the opioid epidemic from spiraling out of control again. So I'm wondering if you had conversations with the city, if they're supportive of this effort to push for legislation, what's that like?
Well, we're all a part of the city. NYPD's Office of Special Narcotics Prosecutor. I think now that we're releasing the grand jury report, until it was approved by the judge, was confidential. That will be kind of what we'll be using to raise awareness of this and to promote a legislative solution. And we'll work with the city council. I know the city council representatives are very, very concerned about overdose deaths in their community. And legislators are too. I think we need to educate them, and that's our hope, that we'll be able to do that through using this as a format for that.
One more.
Lacking a state law is the solution to think every case federally?
Well, that's not every case is a federal case, as they say. And so we'd have to think about what other avenues we might be able to pursue. Look, When it comes to protecting people in the city, we're not going to just throw in the towel. We'll try to think more creatively and continue to work closely with our federal partners.
Thank you, folks.